A very warm welcome, everybody. We begin this session with a lecture on a very famous 18th century British political thinker whose name is Edmund Burke. Edmund Burke's period actually is from 1729 to 1797. Now, at the very beginning, it should be explained to you that although Edmund Burke is a very famous 18th century British political thinker, he is a very prominent figure as a political theorist. Yet, if you go through the standard books on history of Western political thought, then it's very strange that Edmund Burke is not very widely discussed. You come across many other British political theorists, but Edmund Burke's name does not figure in a very big way in the standard writing, standard books on Western political thought. Somehow his works, his writings, well, they are there, no doubt, but somehow they do not figure very prominently. So this calls for an explanation that why Edmund Burke, although otherwise a very important public figure of 18th century England, yet why his name does not figure so prominently in the standard discussions on Western political thought. The explanation very simply is this, and therein lies a kind of puzzle so far as Burke is concerned. When we generally talk about Western political thought, particularly political thought in England, say in 17th century or 18th century or even 19th century, then all of you know perhaps that it is liberal political thought which more or less constitutes the foundation of British political thinking. Liberalism, that is the hallmark of British political thought. Not that other trends were not there, but liberalism is a striking feature of British political thought because liberalism, well, it had its birth in England. Now, when we talk about Burke, the interesting thing about him is this, that it is difficult to characterize Burke in the sense that if you ask a question whether Burke was a liberal or not, the answer, as I said, is a bit enigmatic, a bit intriguing, a bit puzzling. The reason is that Burke, of course, professed, Burke, of course, shared lots of elements which go into the making of liberalism, and that way, on one level, Burke can certainly be characterized as a liberal. But then, very peculiarly, Burke also put forward certain viewpoints, in fact, for which he was so famous, for which, in fact, made him so famous. And if we go into those strands of Burke's political writings or Burke's political thought, then what we come across is that Burke is putting forward certain viewpoints which straightway challenge the very premises of liberal values, very premises of liberal thinking, very premises of liberal ideas. So one can say that Burke was a liberal, but liberal with a difference. To understand in what sense Burke can be characterized as a liberal with a difference, we have to straightway focus on one of his very famous pieces. In fact, this is one of his most famous pieces, at the same time one of his most controversial pieces. That is Reflections on the Revolution in France, which he wrote in the year 1790, just 7 years before his death and 1 year after the French Revolution of 1789. Actually what happened was that after the French Revolution of 1789 took place, Burke sent 2 letters to one of his friends in France. And of these 2 letters, one is short, the other is long. The longer piece, that piece is actually known as, and this carried the title, Reflections on the Revolution in France. This work of Burke made him not only very famous, but also extremely controversial and debatable. What we come across in Burke is this. Till he wrote this piece, that is Reflections on the Revolution in France in 1790, well, till then, Burke put forward views, Burke professed ideas, Burke defended certain norms and certain values, which can straightway be regarded as exercises in standard liberal thinking. I will give you just 1 or 2 examples. Burke was born in Ireland. He was an Irishman, and Burke very strongly defended the cause of Irish independence for the reason that England, the then British government, well, it persecuted the Roman Catholics in Ireland. And Burke, being an Irishman, just could not put up with this kind of attitude, this kind of policy of the British government vis-a-vis the Irish Catholics. So, Burke defended the cause of Irish independence. Burke uncompromisingly defended the cause of American War of Independence. Burke defended the impeachment of Warren Hastings because of the corrupt practices he had indulged in India. So all these show that Burke was definitely a person who believed in liberal values, who believed in freedom, who believed in democracy, who believed in tolerance, who believed in autonomy of the individual. But then, what is very interesting is that after the French Revolution took place in 1789, which was greeted by all progressive people across Europe, which was greeted by lots of friends of Edmund Burke. Many Englishmen, they really extend a very warm welcome to the French Revolution of 1789. But Burke very strongly and very uncompromisingly opposed the cause of French Revolution. Now, this actually later led to the conclusion, and this is the very standard understanding which developed later, that Burke, although apparently a liberal, he actually effectively professed or believed in conservatism. He believed in order, he believed in status quo, he was opposed to radical change, he was opposed to revolution, he was opposed to any kind of idea which challenged the existing established order. That way, Burke should be understood as a figure, as a political theorist of conservatism. Now, how to explain it, or how to characterize, or how to understand these so-called elements of conservatism in Burke, as reflected in this work of Edmund Burke, that is Reflections on the Revolution of France in 1789. Now, to understand this point, we have to identify some of the very interesting, very peculiar characteristics of Burke's political thinking, particularly with reference to his reflections on the French Revolution. First, Burke, philosophically speaking, was opposed to any kind of preconceived notion, preconceived idea, a priori understanding, a priori concepts, a priori values associated, for example, with idealism. That is a hypothetical concept of freedom, a hypothetical concept of justice, a hypothetical concept of, say, equality, Burke was opposed to any such preconceived, pre-given concepts. This is number one. Number two, Burke was also opposed to the typical contractualist understanding that our society, our state, our government, well, these are products of human intervention. In other words, this shows that although he apparently believed in liberal values, but the most important characteristic of liberalism, that is the focus on autonomy of the individual, the focus on individualism, focus on human intervention, well, this somehow is not accepted by Burke. Burke's understanding is that this idea of human intervention in the making of society, in the making of political order, well, this is just not acceptable. Now, let us look at the third point of Burke. Once we understand that Burke rejects the Platonic understanding of any a priori, pre-given concepts, once we appreciate the point that Burke is actually opposed to any kind of human intervention, human role in the making of our society, order, government, politics, etc., etc., we now can identify the third point of Burke. The third point of Burke is this. Burke believes in tradition. Burke believes in the anchorage of our society, our thinking, our government, our history, in certain values, in certain sentiments, in certain kind of myth, which has gone into our consciousness. That is, our history, our politics, our society, everything is embedded in certain historical, mythological roots, which cannot be questioned, which is sacrosanct. In other words, Burke believes in conserving, preserving the order which has come down to us throughout the ages, throughout history, throughout tradition. So, as the order has come down to us, we must accept it, we must preserve it, and it is our sacred duty, it is our obligation to abide by this sanctity of this order. If anybody, and this is now the fourth characteristic of Burke's understanding, Burke very categorically states that if anybody tries to break this order, the order which Burke characterizes as a natural order, this natural order is a product of natural law. So the order which has come down to us, the order which is given, if somebody through human intervention wants to break this order, wants to disturb this order, wants to question this order, then what will happen is that those who will try to do this, those who will try to indulge in this kind of mischievous activity, well, they will be punished. They will be punished by nature itself. They will be punished by God. And this leads to, this is the next point of Burke, that is, this is the ground, this is what explains why Burke was so strongly opposed to the French Revolution. Burke's understanding was very simple. In the French Revolution, what happened was this. The French Revolution was actually a kind of movement. It was a kind of activity through which certain revolutionaries, a band of revolutionaries, a group of revolutionaries, well, they wanted to challenge the existing order in France. They wanted to overthrow, they wanted to turn down the existing established order in France and replace it by a new order. The horizons of this new order, the outline of that new order was not known to anyone. So this challenge of something unknown, the challenge of something which was not given, which was not yet established, which was not yet verified, which was not yet proved, well, this was unacceptable to Edmund Burke. So Burke believed that French Revolution was a kind of revolution aimed against the existing order. Therefore, French Revolution was a revolt against tradition, against order, against nature, and therefore the French Revolution cannot be accepted. And he predicted that those who have indulged in this kind of act, an act against nature, act against history, act against tradition, well, those who have done it, they will eventually have to face punishment. In fact, after the French Revolution, as all of you know, which later, that is, the revolution took place in 1789, but shortly thereafter, the French Revolution passed through a phase of what is known as the Reign of Terror. So Burke said, this is exactly what I apprehended, and this is what is going on in France. That is, revolution will ultimately lead to chaos, disorder, breakdown, instability, and this is ultimately the consequence of any such act of revolution which tries to challenge the existing order. Finally, what Burke tries to point out is this, and this requires careful attention. Does it mean, therefore, that Burke was opposed to any kind of change, any kind of revolution, any kind of, say, act which challenges the existing order? Burke's understanding is very simple. This can be explained on two levels. First, Burke says, in principle, we have to oppose tyranny. So, those who are tyrants, those who are autocrats, a king or a queen or anyone, a leader, who goes against the constitution, who goes against laws, who challenges the existing norms and principles, well, in that case, that person can, of course, be deposed. That is on level of one explanation. On another level, that is the second level of explanation, Burke points out, Burke explains very clearly that if we look at, and thereby if we contrast the French Revolution of 1789 with the English Glorious Revolution of 1688, then we come across a fundamental difference. Very interestingly and very significantly, Burke defends the revolution of 1688, the English Revolution of 1688, while he is uncompromisingly opposed to the French Revolution of 1789. Now, what is the explanation? The explanation for Burke is very simple. He says that so far as the English Revolution is concerned, well, the English Revolution in a way was a kind of revolution which did not challenge the existing order, which tried to reinforce, which actually tried to strengthen the existing English customs, traditions, values, property laws, etc. The English spirit, that actually the Glorious Revolution tried to sanctify in a bigger way. And when the defenders of the French Revolution said that they actually, through the French Revolution, wanted to transplant the ideas of the English Glorious Revolution in France, the ideas of democracy, the ideas of freedom, etc., Burke was not at all convinced. Burke's understanding was no, the English Revolution tried to strengthen the roots of the British tradition. But the French Revolution, well, in the first place, the French Revolution, it was just impossible to transplant English ideas on the French soil. And moreover, it was not the case in the case of France. It was not the case for France at all. Because so far as France is concerned, there the idea was not to strengthen the traditions, customs, then the historical roots of French society. They wanted to uproot everything. They wanted to change everything. They wanted to actually disturb the French tradition, French history, French norms, French values. They wanted to replace everything by something new. This whole idea of replacement was simply unacceptable to Edmund Burke. So, if we look at these aspects, these characteristics of Burke's ideas, then I think you can now have a very clear idea of why Burke should be called a liberal with a difference, a liberal with a conservative mind. He tried to fuse together certain elements of liberalism, apparently, with, of course, a very strong inclination towards conservatism. Finally, the question arises, well, what happened to this piece of Burke? Burke, please remember, Burke was a great orator, Burke was a great public figure, and Burke was admired by people in England and outside England. So when Burke published this text, that is Reflections on the Revolution in France in 1790, so that naturally the question arises, what was the consequence of this text? What happened to this text? The answer is somewhat, I would say, disturbing. Disturbing in the sense that for Burke it was a bit disturbing. Burke's understanding of French Revolution, well, it was not appreciated widely. Burke lost many of his friends who could not agree with Burke's perception, Burke's interpretation of the French Revolution. Many friends of Burke, they did not share his conservative thinking. Many of his friends, they argued, they pointed out that Burke was putting down ideas which were just unacceptable to anyone who believed in the values of democracy. So Burke naturally lost many of his friends. Burke had a number of friends who otherwise agreed with him, who otherwise had a great friendship with him, and they belonged to the House of Commons. So Burke lost the friendship of many of them who were in the House of Commons. Burke was actually a very important member of the Whigs in Britain. You know, there are two major parties in Britain, two major groups, the Tory and the Whigs. So Burke was a very important member of the Whigs. Now, Burke lost his association with many of his Whig friends. And this is how Burke eventually, as I told you earlier, he wrote this book, wrote this long letter, the second letter to one of his friends in France in the year 1790, 1 year after after the French Revolution. So with these words, I conclude, I think you now have a fairly clear picture of the views of Edmund Burke, particularly with reference to his very famous yet debatable text, Reflections on the Revolution in France, written and published in the year 1790. Thank you.